Hello there, and welcome to the Man of Jackistan. The show currently pending a catchier intro slogan. While I'm being a little self-deprecating, let me say that what you're about to hear was outlined with a few facts researched but not thoroughly edited, and hopefully as time goes on, I'll hone in on a better format and get better at the editing. As a 26-year-old, it's gonna be pretty bad to unironically see the low video quality of this. You'll probably hear the AC in the background, you'll hear my cats being cats, but just bear with me. I think you'll like what I have to say. So on that note, let's get to it. This is about essential workers. During this whole COVID crisis, that term's been tossed around a lot, but for the sake of simplicity, let's define essential jobs and essential workers as those that we rely on for modern society to run smoothly. This can be everything from healthcare workers to gas station attendants. People who often get taken for granted, if not worse. We rely on a lot of different people's work, yet all too often we pay these people pretty poorly and treat them like crap. More like expendable workers, not essential ones. Don't patronize these people, of which I am one. Labeling them essential and then sending people into unsafe work environments without proper compensation, both financially and, in other ways, it's just a dick move. A lot of these people who oppose the lockdowns are paying lip service to essential workers, while realistically just thinking of them as, just the cashier, or not thinking twice about the life lived by some guy who mops shit up. But the reality of all this means that you're willing to sacrifice human life just to go out places that you really want to. I mean, even just to stock your pantry with food or have your elderly grandparents taken care of and for you to get around town, this requires tons of people punching into their jobs at food processing plants, grocery stores, truck drivers, healthcare professionals, custodians, gas station attendants, Uber drivers, public transportation operators, all kinds of people. If you think about it, these people offer an invaluable service with their work. Of course, we assign a number to it, pay them that amount, and it's usually a pretty small amount, and then we don't think twice about the plight. The pandemic has made us more acutely aware of all this, or at least for me. But what a lot of these people do was still integral before COVID. Integral, or in other words, essential. So then, what do people like this deserve in compensation for services they offer? Some dignity and respect, first and foremost. Simply appreciating the work that people do goes a long way in and of itself. Thanking the person rather than being a dick to the person at the checkout at CVS might help. Literally speaking of a lot of these jobs as essential and these workers as essential workers is a good start. But we also need to provide more materially as well. And the fact is that right now, a grocery store cashier, that person's roommate might make 2 or 3 times as much money as he does right now off of unemployment with the expanded benefits. And this is by no means a dig at the extra $600 through July, because I largely agree with that. But why would someone want to go to work under that type of circumstance? I mean, in so much as I mean that leaving the house to spend 8 hours exposed to hundreds of random people and, help make the country function with no recognition other than being called essential by some, but being treated poorly and yelled at for not bagging things right, I mean, in that context, it's actually more insulting, at least to me. Like, imagine having a hard day of, people coming through with only 2 items at a time because they just wanted to get out of the house and bought 1 bag of Cheetos, which is maximizing your exposure to other people from all over. Dealing with Karens bitching about paper and plastic bags, and then you go home and you see your roommate sprawled out on the couch all nice and stoned, complaining about how he had to binge watch Stranger Things again because he's so bored. I mean, yet he's literally being paid for that boredom and getting paid much, much more than you are. I mean that's fucked. And to be clear, the remedy here isn't to strip that unemployed roommate and millions of other people away from that extra $600 a week. The solution isn't to lower anyone's living standards, but to elevate those of many. I should note that in the recently proposed and passed through the House HEROES Act, the latest round of the coronavirus relief from Congress, they've included some form of extra pay for essential workers. Whether this will get passed or not is up for debate. Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell has said this entire bill is dead on arrival. But even if we give essential workers a token lump sum for their work during this crisis, I think in reality, this problem goes beyond just the conditions during the pandemic. Though, that's just magnified the visibility of this. More broadly, how did we go from a society where someone with just a high school diploma could get a job that paid well enough to raise a family, to one where millions of us are struggling so desperately? People haven't gotten less adept over time. I mean, as far as I know, humans haven't devolved in the last half century to be shittier workers. And it isn't everyone's fault individually. It's not just laziness. I mean, yes, some people are lazy pieces of shit. Some of them eventually change, some always will be, but this isn't about them. This is about the rest of us, the most of us. History doesn't repeat itself, but it often rhymes. That's my cliche for the day. But seriously, you may have heard or noticed that income inequality today is pretty bad and widening. It's almost as bad, actually, as it was in the Gilded Age, in the era of monopolies. So what else was the same back then? As a little parallel, at that point in our history, the early 1900s, the working class had jobs mostly involving production, coal mining, manufacturing, things like that. Back then, manufacturing, all of it, it was dangerous. It paid like shit, and it was just miserable. I mean, most jobs were, honestly, but if you were like most people, if you were your grandparents, or whoever, your life was probably just work, sleep, and church. The priest told you that in the next life your hard work would be rewarded, yet someone's hard work was being rewarded in this life. Americans saw a massive rise in wealth and stature at that point in time, and with no rules or restrictions on the markets, these monopolies quickly form, with one person controlling virtually an entire single industry. It was at this time that John D. Rockefeller became the richest person ever, adjusted for inflation. You could make the argument that some, emperors from ancient times had more wealth, but it's too hard to compare net worth to people living in those times. So, even though it was the result of white-collar Wall Street guys speculating on stock prices and, other things in the financial sector, the Great Depression that this caused ended up being especially hard on people like factory workers, as demand for various goods fell. So that sucked. Unions throughout all the time since factories, became more prominent, they fought, and they were often squashed with squads hired by business owners. I guess it was cheaper to pay thugs to beat up union leaders rather than to just pay your workers more and let them take bathroom breaks and things like that. So, simplifying things, then came World War II. Millions of young men went overseas to fight, and the country needed tons of war material, yet the traditional labor pool of young men had been sent overseas. So, the importance of manufacturing was recognized more than ever before as American factories fought the Nazis and Japanese. And also, even a little before this and during that, President Roosevelt also had worker and union-friendly policies. The importance of this really can't be understated, since he was in charge through most of the Depression and the war. And after the war, and sadly after FDR died, the US was pretty much the only country left with any industrial capacity. I mean, all the other factories everywhere else were pretty bombed out from 6 years of world warring. So naturally, demand for American goods went up during this period, though the New Deal policies, in my opinion, contributed more to the new level of prosperity available to a broader number of workers. But either way, by the 1950s, these concurrences made manufacturing jobs highly respectable, secure, and higher paying than ever before. This was enough to foster the growth of the middle class in the post-war era, that idyllic, 50s suburban sprawl. But good things have to end. Of the two main factors that I would, cite here, the first would be Reaganomics and neoliberalism, etc., etc., which pretty much chipped away at the middle class slowly but surely. And then second comes our consumer-based economy that helped give way to the services sector, coming to absorb a larger share of overall workers. So the most obvious, more liable culprit in this shift to neoliberalism is the shift to neoliberalism that has gradually occurred since the 1980s. Excuse me. It's initiated under Ronald Reagan here and Margaret Thatcher in Britain. And just to define some terms here, because neoliberalism gets thrown around, and it refers to the economic policies that favor less government intervention, deregulation, laissez-faire, free market economics, and that having financial freedom is the surest way to achieve your freedom or liberty or personal happiness. It's kind of used derogatorily a lot of the times. Internationally, neoliberalism has led to free trade agreements and increased trade between nations, and with that trade went many manufacturing jobs to cheap labor markets like China. The neoliberalism kind of exists in contrast to the New Deal, which was a Keynesian consensus that lasted from the Great Depression through roughly the 1970s, about 40 years, and it's been about 40 years since neoliberalism really took off, so hopefully, if these things are 40-year cycles, we're headed for change. Except obviously that's a coincidence, not some kind of discernible trend. That's off topic and important. It's important to address that because it's a confusing term and it has the word liberal in it, and modern American liberalism is just about the exact opposite of neoliberalism, at least in economic sense. Neoliberalism is that whole let the markets decide mentality where the state takes its hands off the wheel, assuming that things will just work out the best for everyone the less they interfere. I can and will do a whole rant on that later, but this is already going to be kind of long, so for our purposes here, the deregulatory neoliberal shift that's occurred since the 80s set the stage for these slippery conditions for workers, stagnant wages, and things like that. And as I said, I'll expand on that, but, that type of system also helped to crush the unions that made the working and middle class so strong, which is an important component of workers having the power to negotiate their fate with collective bargaining and unions. So, but also, the undercurrent there is a transitioning from an economy focused on production, like manufacturing, mining, things like that, to a more service-based economy. And this, played a role in this degradation too. The factories, they had powerful labor unions by the middle of the last century, and they negotiated wages and working conditions with employers. But as more service jobs emerged and took a larger share of the labor pool, these industries didn't just spontaneously generate with well-established unions in place. And to management, unions can be kind of pesky. It's basically a force that makes you pay more for your workers, and it damages your bottom line. Plus, with governments less supportive of organized labor and workers come the 1980s, that added pressure putting up with unions where they no longer existed. Sorry, I have something in there. A lot of professions and service workers do belong to unions. That's, they're not entirely gone. But, it's not like a lack of unions in and of themselves has led to worse working conditions for Americans. And unions aren't a guarantee for better things. Weak unions and a corporate culture that seeks solely to maximize profits with a green light, or at least a blind eye from the government, and the effects of neoliberalism in general, altogether have major implications in this story here. Nowadays, hard work alone doesn't ensure success. Americans need to abandon that whole mythos, even though it's comforting. Holding on to this sense of superiority, it almost makes an excuse for not seeking to improve. America has its success stories, and that's known the world over, and that doesn't bother me, as long as it's done ethically. Like, go make your millions of dollars, that's fine. Just do it ethically. But for every success story, there's the ugly underside of that. There's the business that failed. The smart person who wanted to go to college but had a relative needing care, or had untreated mental health issues. Somebody unable to start their business because they had no access to capital, no wealth to build from. There's systemic biases, unfairness, the ungodly sum of money a husband spends on his sick wife, footing the bill because his healthcare plan sucks. Any combination of these stories play out every single day and impede people from, realizing the success that they could attain under other circumstances. So why, in the richest country of all time, does somebody working full-time, doing something vital to our society's functioning, often not earn enough money to support themselves? Recently, AOC suggested that essential workers should strike when the pandemic passes, and she took a lot of heat for that, mostly from the right. But how do you think our grandparents, parents' generation got benefits? Healthcare, PTO, fair pay, and all that. They didn't just get it in a vacuum. I mean, all those factors were involved, and they did something about it through collective bargaining, aka, unions, strikes. So look at this a little closer, okay? The 20th century, when it started, there was child labor, there was no minimum wage, no safety standards, brutally long hours with no breaks, and unions were crushed routinely and violently. I mean, if you got injured by a company's shoddy equipment, tough shit. Hopefully by then you had enough kids who could go into the coal mines and bring home some money to support your injured ass, because workman's comp and Social Security and all of that was just the talk of some people deemed crazy and idealistic at the time. Then 50 years later, a factory worker or a coal miner could easily afford a nice house, healthcare, kids, and send those kids to college for like $5, and then retire with a nice pension. Not to mention all of that on top of, at the very, very least, having a minimum wage and, working in an environment where there were laws preventing 5-year-olds from performing dangerous tasks in a coal mine, and safety standards from at least the most egregious negligence from employers. And things didn't become that way simply because the market decides and an unfettered free market somehow just created those conditions out of goodwill alone. Because business owners and oil tycoons suddenly had a change of heart and thought, you know what, I'll put a huge dent in my profits and, just so I can give these people wage increases, let them take lunch breaks, stop hiring children, even though that's a good bang for your buck. That sounds good. No, that's not how it happened. That's not how things unfolded, and that's not how things are going to change going into the future either. And no, this isn't to say that all of the factory owners and managers were necessarily evil. Life has more nuance than just good and bad, us and them. Sure, some were, callous dickheads, and especially, back then to succeed, times were different. Some of them had families that they had to feed, and they were just abiding by the norms of the time. Others would just convince themselves that the suffering they saw was an illusion, and cutting corners was necessary for survival. Or they cut corners because they could. A meat packing plant could sprinkle sawdust in their product to stretch the real beef a little further, in the same way that today a dope dealer cuts their powder with whatever baking soda garbage or some shit to make it look like more, because no one's really stopping them. Customers aren't regularly giving it a purity test. I mean, obviously if it's cut too much, then customers could buy from somewhere else, if there is a somewhere else. But even this incentive, to not cut it too much, but to get awfully damn close, it couldn't completely stamp out all dilution across the industry indefinitely. It just doesn't work that way. And by it, I mean humans. Another note on that. Some employers did try to do good, or what they considered good, or alternately, they did good things for the benefits they received from doing so. Famously, Henry Ford paid his workers well, gave them Saturdays off. Although beyond this altruism, he had an ulterior motive, and that was that workers with more time and more money, and less misery, will go out and spend more money buying things. It stimulates that consumer economy. So he and, other business owners could actually benefit from treating people right. Shocker, right? Actually, in a lot of instances, the morally right thing to do is also the most pragmatic. It's the most logical choice in terms of a cost-benefit analysis. Issues are often not framed in a way where there's room to absorb and accommodate these little nuances. With all that said, I want to stress that the altruism of individuals in charge only goes so far. It's regulations, largely, that reinforce the shift to the golden age of labor in the middle of the last century. While certain things like better pay is needed for workers and healthcare coverage, paid sick leave, all that, they overall have a net benefit to society, not just those people. But implementing them comes at a cost incurred by the businesses and their owners. And obviously you can't jack up requirements so high immediately, or some businesses will go out of business. But there's a happy balance, Awarding modest gains to workers that we as a society rely on, it won't be the end of the world or even detrimental in most cases. If it would hurt too many businesses to give wage increases or things like this, there's also a route of funding it with government spending or supplemental tax credits. But either way, the relative wealth and resources lost by the rich in these instances are minuscule compared to the benefits gained by these workers. You know what I mean? If you make $20,000 a year, getting an extra $5,000 is a huge difference in how you live versus if you make $1 million a year. Having $1 million and $5,000 is not really going to change anything at all. Also, there's this whole myth around that, raising the minimum wage would put all kinds of businesses out of business. And I can't speak for every industry and every company. I mean, some, like food service, they often operate on paper-thin margins, but also there is a small effect in some areas when you raise the minimum wage that squeezes job growth temporarily, and it's a small effect. Conservatives, again, will argue that raising the minimum wage would actually cost a lot of jobs and lead to unemployment and thus less money for workers. And that claim's just ludicrous and stupid. Go back to National Review with that line. It's not true. In theory, maybe it's true, but in reality, the place where it's best to base your policy off of, that's just not the case. The states and cities in the past decade that increased their minimum wage saw almost no impact on employment, and the impacts that they did see were often temporary and, readjusted after a short amount of time. And the benefits of raising a minimum wage, like lifting people out of poverty and into higher living standards, that far outweighs the loss of a tiny number of jobs initially in the beginning when you change that wage. It also has secondary effects to raise wages, like reducing turnover and, training new employees is a huge cost. So if you can keep people on board, you don't necessarily see the money you're saving in that case, but it actually is better for businesses. It's, but seriously, if you make a lot of money, or enough, it might not seem like much. And maybe you might think, oh, if you budget wisely, but really, $10 an hour isn't money to live on. Even full-time, even 50 hours a week with, bonus pay. And also going from even just $10 an hour to 11, that's a huge difference. That 10% more cash available to someone struggling to pay their bills, that's a huge deal. So after risking their lives to fill your gas tank and clean up highly contagious places, providing more for essential workers is a must. It was a must before all of this, and it should apply beyond workers that we just deem essential. Start with them and go out from there. But at any rate, doing so in a way that doesn't completely constrict the economy is important. And having solutions for that issue, real or perceived, creates at least good enough optics to hopefully entice some Republicans on the idea. But how could we possibly do that? We do that with Republicans' favorite thing, besides racism, tax breaks. I'm a big fan of targeted tax incentives to accomplish government agenda items, and that's like the nerdiest thing to say, but I'll stand by it. And there's nothing secret there, nothing nefarious, but if companies are gonna skip out on paying their fair share to the country as a whole, then it better be for a good reason, not just because they're big and rich and already because they're rich and big. The pandemic-induced recession complicates this and pushes back the immediacy of doing this by a little bit, but nonetheless, in this scenario, companies that were once paying below the new minimum wage can deduct the difference between employees' previous wage and the new minimum wage and not pay taxes on it. So, and this would last for a year, 2 years, however long necessary, maybe longer. So, to explain this a little better, basically, if you were paid $11 an hour and then the minimum wage goes up to $15 an hour, in this rendition, your employer would either not pay taxes on $4 for every hour you worked that year, the difference, or even more extremely, pay $4 less in taxes for every hour you worked that year to basically supplement that additional pay. So in essence, employers would end up paying the same amount of money as they would have before the wage increase in that second version of it. It looked good on paper. Interestingly enough, Trump actually gets his way in this scenario too. He's gone on and on and on about this payroll tax cut. So if we use this shiny red ball to get him to chase enthusiastically after something useful, want a treat? Want to go for a walk? That kind of thing? We can actually accomplish something really good here. And because this is a payroll tax cut, ultimately. The only thing in the version I'm proposing is that there's strings attached. Not even really strings. You don't really have to do anything extra. It's just itemized. But it's, it's a good way to do that, I think, to phase into that. So in addition to making the lives of employees everywhere a little less difficult and rewarding, The extra capital being put into the marketplace helps stimulate the economy. If you raise worker pay or whatever, especially right now, anything that we can do through policy to increase consumer spending is of the utmost importance. A quick aside, a note for those of you who hear this and look skeptically at this capitalistically piggish sounding statement. Consumerism isn't inherently bad, neither is capitalism. Brainless pursuit of materials is a bleak way to spend a lifetime. Companies can do awful things exploiting workers and the environment. Greed abounds, and unrestricted capitalism can lead to terrible outcomes. But consumer spending is what creates a lot of jobs. People spend money on things that they like, buying it from companies that now have more money and spend that money and give some to workers who spend their money on more things. With more money to go places, that creates more jobs or raises wages. You can see how all this gets out of hand as we as humans lose sight of what's important. Although importance is subjective. Somebody dedicating their life on this earth to accumulating the most stuff is not on its face any better or worse than you choosing to learn new things and raise kids. I mean, if that person's willing to steal and hurt other people to get that shit, then it's bad. And generally, the pursuit of knowledge and continuing the human species are regarded as positive things, but still, capitalism is the best system so far, but it has to have guardrails. Some would call this a mixed economy. I wouldn't. I'd say capitalism with guardrails. The word regulation conjures up, unnecessary rules enforced by some shrewd little jerk who never gets any pussy. But in the sense that I mean it, it's guardrails put in place that better us collectively. Regulated capitalism. That's what I'm advocating for. I've been trying to come up with a catchy term for it. Capergism? I don't know. That's the best I got. I'll get back to you with that. But that. So back to the point. Guardrails on this rant. The concept of getting more cash in the hands of the non-wealthiest people in society has a Keynesian tone. Demand-side economics, to be fancy like that. It's easy to remember as the economics model that isn't totally bunk. It's not the one that the right wing pushes and repackages every single generation to make it easier for a few people to accumulate absurd amounts of wealth while leaving the rest of us out of the pie. They get all the slices, we get a few crumbs, and we don't even get the crumbs. The bunk kind of economic ideology I'm talking about is supply-side economics. I won't fall for it, not again. The idea that giving even more money to the people who are already rich, based on the stated assumption, or under the pretext that they'll invest it to create new jobs, allowing their wealth to trickle down to the rest of us, that's bunk. At one point, I actually bought into this. I bought into it with the little money I had in my head, and as most people do who unwittingly back this almost conspiratorially skewed ideology do, because the rich are rich for a reason, right? They know how to spend money in smart ways better than the poor, who obviously are poor because it's their fault. That's actually how I thought at one point. No longer, because I have, the ability to look around me and see what's happening, but people are at different points, so it's not totally useful to attack everyone because they're not at the same place mentally as you are. As a side note, Anyway, like I said, at one point, though, I was staunchly conservative, to be honest, and then I opened my eyes and I stepped in the doorway, and here I am now. So, supply-side economics, it's been consistently shown to be bunk. If taxes were like 90%, and the government lowered it to 70%, then people would have more money to invest. But, back in the 80s, Reagan championed this, and some people called it Reaganomics. And taxes have inched lower ever since, creating a budget deficit. And, to be fair, the New Deal era had exorbitantly high tax rates, especially on the rich, that have been incrementally lowered since the 1960s. But a lot of that was there to pay off the national debt racked up from fighting the Second World War. But at one point, taxes were really high, like a lot higher. As late as 1963, the top income bracket paid 91% on income. And obviously, rich people find loopholes and invest and this and that, but when tax rates were already historically low before Trump took office, it made no sense to drop them even lower yet with his whole tax act. Like, why? Nearly $2 trillion tax cut for the rich and for big corporations in the midst of a prospering, growing economy. That's the exact time when you should raise taxes to pay off debts. I mean, how does that work out? If the government felt inclined to cut taxes then, they should have done so at a massive rate for the lower and middle classes, allowing those at the lower end of the income distribution to catch up. I mean, watching the economy grow and seeing the stock market and all that, when you can barely afford to pay rent or buy diapers, that sucks. If the S&P keeps hitting new highs, then the rich are getting rich already. Also, you could vastly improve the lives of like 30 people for every one rich person you make slightly richer. I just pulled that number out of my ass, but I mean, that's essentially how it's structured. But those tax cuts in the middle of a good economy just made the rich richer. Did it help the overall economy? Trump claimed that those tax cuts would lead to 4 or 5 or 6% growth of GDP. I mean, that'd be great. Even 4% growth would be almost double the current rate, or the pre-pandemic rate. So let's see, how did trickle theory work out this time? US GDP growth in 2015, 2.88%. US GDP growth in 2016, 1.57%. 2017, 2.22%. Then 2018, the year that the Trump tax cuts took effect, it went up to a whopping 2.86%. Not even higher than the rate 3 years earlier under Obama. Maybe it takes time for this to kick in and work and grow the economy. What about 2019's rate of growth? 2.3%, even lower, so bunk. Supply side economics is fucking bunk. In reality, the trajectory of the economy went on unchanged from around Obama's second term all the way up through March of this year. Trump didn't do anything. Since we spent the last decade re-emerging from a bad recession, the gains made in the markets may not have been noticeable until a few years ago. So that's why it may have seemed, around the time Trump took office, the economy was doing good. Because most of the Obama years was still the recovery, but that's when the trajectory of growth was put into place. Trump just didn't fuck it up terribly for the first 3 years. So Trump added nothing of benefit to the equation. His tax cuts were a flop. It didn't boost growth wildly, or even mildly for that matter, to pass Trump's tax cuts. So if we look at it, for the price tag of almost $2 trillion added to the budget deficit during a good economy, we got no tangible benefits other than making the really rich people a little richer. Betsy DeVos, she can afford a 15th yacht now, probably. It'll only be an 80-foot one, since she still had to pay something. But, I'm not one of those, I'm not one of those deficit hawks, frankly, because that's not grounded in, modern thinking. The idea that, you have to, every single year, you have to balance out a budget, blah, blah, blah. We shouldn't spend manically, but, if we're going to incur a budget deficit, it should be for a purpose. It can do good to do that. It's all a calculation. It's a calculation where Trump doesn't use a calculator because he knows numbers better than the calculator. I'm like a human calculator, probably only second to Archimedes, and even him, I was close. That's something Trump would say. Actually, no, he would never say that because he doesn't know who the hell Archimedes is. At any rate, a deficit increase in the trillions that led to no real additional growth. Take that and also factor in the scrapping of environmental regulations by the Trump administration, and it actually amounts to a really hefty cost paid by the public. For what? Like struggling companies? No, in 2017, a survey of major corporations actually showed that they had extra cash on hand. Billions and billions of dollars that they didn't know what to do with. This is some of the Fortune 500 companies. And this was the year before the tax cuts went into effect while they were writing up those laws. They didn't need, it's not like they were like, we need, if only we had a little more money, we could do this. It's even more infuriatingly, though, and I hate to inform you about this, but tax cuts that lead to a deficit aren't just like, they paid less money, whatever, it doesn't affect me, not good. No, it actually does affect you and me. Because somebody has to pay back the deficit money later on. And it'll be with some interest. So to sum it up, the rich and some major corporations that already had enough money, if not too much money, are accumulating even more money now, that you and I will need to pay back with interest later on. Fortune 500 companies are even more fortunate now, I guess. But, we did all of that to boost growth, except growth didn't actually increase at all. Were you wondering what these companies used their extra money on? The tax breaks, they got billions of extra dollars. Maybe they spent it on making new jobs or this and that. I looked into it. Mostly, they just did stock buybacks, which consolidates the power and artificially inflates the stock prices for that company. Also, they rewarded their shareholders with a lot of their money, with dividends. Some of the money went into new equipment, apparently, and one-time bonuses for employees, not shareholders, but the people who work there. If you subscribe to trickle-down economics, then a tiny dewdrop got down to the floor, but it quickly evaporated before it could be absorbed even in the carpet. So for every $1 spent on employee raises, from the extra money from that, bonuses and raises, they spent $149 on stock buybacks. 149 times as much money on stock buybacks than actually giving the people who work there more money. So that's where their priorities are. Again, if we wanted to stimulate wage growth or something, we could do a targeted tax break. You get all this extra money, but only if you use it for raises or something like that. That's not this though. That wasn't the GOP's agenda. To actually see workers make more money. There was no strings attached, and as a result, only 28 of the Fortune 500 companies actually raised wages that year. The list of enraging little tidbits goes on like that. So then the pandemic hits, right? And you have these gargantuan companies needing bailouts now. I'm going to pick on the airlines. The big airlines obviously benefited from the tax cuts, and like other corporations, used a lot of that capital on things like stock buybacks to consolidate their power and riches and artificially inflate their stock prices. So because of that, now they're actually low on cash and they need bailouts to stay in business. And this is going to be at the taxpayer's expense, of course. A loan is one thing, a grant is another. Some of these are portions. $25 billion was given from the federal government to a few major airlines. And the agreement was that they'll pay back 30% in the next 5 years. The other 70% is a grant, a freebie. Here you go. Treasury Secretary Steve Mnuchin justified it by saying that the almost $18 billion would actually benefit the taxpayer from not having to pay for unemployment insurance for all those employees. And I didn't do the math. It kind of makes sense. But at the same time, if these companies filed for bankruptcy, there's a strong chance that the employees themselves would be protected, and the company would not go out of business necessarily. And it makes very little sense here that we basically gave these giant firms a bunch of cash, they spent it, and we rewarded them with more free cash. I mean, part of me is kind of like, let them fail. I don't want the employees of those companies to be screwed. Also, just because a company is big doesn't always mean it's bad. Airlines do pollute a ton, though. More like 900 million metric tons of carbon dioxide in 2018. Nonetheless, devil's advocate, little other shoulder guy, that's kind of an overly simplified and glib interpretation. American Airlines and the various other American airlines offer something useful to the American people, as well as the United States as an entity. This has already gotten on pretty long, so I'll save the strategic stuff for a different episode, rant. I just imagine what, as a country, we could have done with the $1.5 trillion essentially spent on Trump tax cuts if it were placed somewhere else. We could absolve student debt, expand healthcare, just give regular people money instead of the richest and, lifeless corporate entities. And there are many deserving rich people. I'm not saying rich equals bad, but you're already rich. If you manage your money well or work, you stay rich. Meanwhile, giving back your fair share through taxes means that others also get a shot at becoming wealthy, or at least not becoming destitute. Before the unemployment rate was officially the worst we've ever recorded this April, Trump et al. Would tout the low unemployment numbers, then go on to say record low unemployment for blacks, record low unemployment for Hispanics. Then they probably said Orientals instead of Asians, because that's how they talk. But mentioning those groups' low unemployment figures, as I said, the pandemic and Trump being a terrible president led to the quadrupling of official unemployment numbers, rising to nearly 15% as of mid-April, which is easily topping the previous record of 10.8%, which was set in 1982. Keep in mind, these records only go back to 1948, which means that the Great Depression isn't included. They use different measures for the Great Depression. But even still, 14.7% unemployment itself is probably higher than the rate in a lot of the 1930s. Not the peak of the Great Depression, but a lot of the 1930s. And there's some statistical minutia that makes the real number of people who are out of work actually higher. But for the sake of argument, let's say this was February, before the pandemic wreaked havoc on the economy, and unemployment was at its lowest point in half a century, 3.5%. That means that almost everybody who wants a job has a job. But just because anyone who wants to work can find an $8 an hour job doesn't mean the economy and the country are functioning super well. Not for many of us, anyway, which begs the question, who are we measuring this for? Like, on what metrics? Which kind of segues nicely into assessing whether GDP is even that relevant. Gross domestic product, GDP, is all the economic activity that takes place in a country in a 1 year period. You can have money or assets, but without spending or making money, it's not really factored in. You could sell your house and make money, but if you're not selling it, the value of that house isn't counted for GDP. But from the GDP, you derive GDP per capita, which is literally just the GDP, all the money, divided by a country's population. And this is an average. It doesn't in any way represent how much money people earn on average or how much money people actually have. So then you can have a country with a super high GDP per capita, but in reality, the money and the resources in that nation are all concentrated in a very small elite class. With 98% of people living in squalid poverty. GDP per capita and stock prices probably don't mean much to somebody who's struggling to pay rent. Half of all Americans don't own any stock, and only about 10% of the population holds 84% of corporate shares. So income inequality shows up in almost all of this data, and it's visibly widening. According to MarketWatch, in 1989, the top 10% of Americans owned 60% of all the wealth. Now it's 70%. I mean, what's even more disturbing than that? For the top 1% of Americans, the concentration of household wealth in that same period went from 23 to 32%. Basically, the rich get richer, and the richest rich become the richest. But does money matter that much? After all, a lot of people don't focus solely on gathering cash and base their worth as a human being on that, right? Even still, money is needed for basic things, and basic things are, costing more and more money. Healthcare, housing, student loans. Without access to healthcare, housing, education, safety, dignity, societies have some serious problems. Because these are all cornerstones of civilization, alongside economic activity itself and material security, food. But on a kind of similar note, a lot of critics of a minimum wage will claim that, eventually there will be inflation, and then the people making minimum wage will be right back to the bottom. If you double minimum wage, then in a year or two, a gallon of milk will cost twice as much, so they're, still at the bottom. And this has some merit, actually. If bread, gas, and rent cost twice as much, then twice as much income isn't doing anything extra for you. That's a legitimate concern. That's why an expansion of the social safety net in society, along with the minimum wage bumps, are the best way to guarantee an optimal increase in the standard of living for everyone. I'd also like to see increase in minimum wages tied to inflation. Say we pass a $15 an hour minimum wage, and all companies have to pay that within 3 years. It takes a couple years to get up there, but you pass a law then that says every year the minimum wage is raised alongside inflation. So that way you don't have to have this debate every couple years of, you can always raise it higher, but you can't put it lower. And, like the minimum wage right now is $7.25 an hour, and it's been that way since 2009. So yeah, with this, Congress would set it in stone, and by setting it in stone, it would be on a sliding scale with inflation. Maybe some disgruntled non-Trump Republicans will, caucus to the Democratic side if they propose this, or maybe the pandemic recession will get so bad that more Republicans will have to. Crises make great catalysts for change and make martyrs the victims of mismanagement. But higher wages, paid sick leave, healthcare, these aren't crazy demands, really. It's not a liberal wish list to give this to everyone or expand it. It's what advanced civilizations do. Seriously, some places have eclipsed us in this respect that we as the United States once boasted about. Countries like Denmark have out-America'd us in the sense of social mobility, democratic values, standard of living. And I love America, by the way. Lots of liberals love America. Because I love it, I criticize it so that it can get better. Nothing happens if nobody has new ideas, wants something better, or speaks up about it. That's the American dream. Despite all of its flaws, I have faith in us. Sometimes cynically. As Winston Churchill once said, you can always count on Americans to do the right thing after they've tried everything else. Well, we tried the whole laissez-faire, let the market decide model, and it appears incompatible with the 21st century in a completely unhinged form. A trickle-down economic experiment lasting 40 years has rejected this hypothesis that was laid out by Milton Friedman. I know a lot of this country has a bizarre aversion to doing anything remotely scientific and evidence-based. Either way, we need to do the things that will more directly and definitely improve the lives of workers that we deem essential, and their families, and the country as a whole. COVID-19 may have no known cure. Sorry, Trump, you might as well dump the hydroxychloroquine. But we have a better prescription to treat economic ailments that America faces. And AOC has a point, because it doesn't look like the powers that be plan to just hand over even the most basic workers' rights that are guaranteed in every one of our peer nations to all of our workers when this is over. You gotta speak up, you gotta fight for these things. And, more broadly, America's soul needs to majorly reassess itself. Individual liberty is an extremely important principle. But in the 21st century, undeniably and inextricably, we're all linked together, and this requires a level of cooperation that was unprecedented even 100 years ago. By doing so, I have no doubt that American ingenuity can once again lead mankind into the future, and a future that we can all look forward to. A vision, a goal, a plan, but it starts by taking care of our own. We need a lot of people to put themselves out there so that our society can operate. And we have to return that favor and make sure that society puts itself in a position to help these individuals operate. So that's all I have for today. I can finally swallow whatever was in my throat for 2/3 of that time. This was the Man of Jackistan, and until next time, bye.